Og við byrjum bara núna. Góðan daginn. Það eiginlega nótt hjá þér, eða ekki?
Já, það nótt hjá mér. Klukkan svona 4. Ég kom með annan kopp hérna kaffi, það alltaf því.
Þú ætlar að spjalla Azure AD. Þú ætlar að taka þetta á ensku, það eru einhverjir þeir sem eru erlendis líka hlusta.
Já, ég held að það verið best fyrir mig að gera þetta á ensku. Ég hef ekki talað íslensku í mörg ár og ég tala íslensku bara við mömmu og pappa og bræður mína. Tvisvar á viku kannski. Þetta var mjög erfitt að gera á ensku.
En ég ætla nú bara að byrja því að þakka þér fyrir að gefa tíman til að fara í þetta með okkur. Og geti kannski svona tala sjálfa þig, sagt frá sjálfu þér.
Já, ég get alveg skipt í ensku eða eitthvað fólk sem er bara á ensku.
Gerðu það bara, byrja því.
No. Okay, good morning. I would say good morning, and not good evening or good day after. In Iceland, it's got early morning. My name is Brekkan. I work for Microsoft in US. I sit in the engineering team for identity, and been here in the US for the past 14 years, working on identity or security in some way or the other. Running a small team of engineers, PMs looking at specifically customer engagements, what we call advocacy, or actually going out and talking about our products, driving engagement such as this, user groups. My core goal with everything we do in my team is talk about the product, understand how customers, partners, developers are using the products, and then get feedback. So please don't hesitate to give some questions and get the conversation going here as well. So get some help with the Q&A as well. So.
Okay, great. So you're going to talk about Azure AD. So I'll just give you the mic.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to change here. Let me make sure that you can see the screen that I have. Do you see my slides?
No.
Very good.
It's a little bit bad connection, it seems.
Let's see what I can do. Should be okay.
There you go. Send live, so you have the slides now.
You got the slides? Everything ready to go?
Perfect.
Ready. So, like I said, that's my Twitter account. Please follow, as well as on LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to take questions offline on that one. My email address is actually bbrekkan@microsoft.com. If you just change the _Microsoft to @microsoft.com as well. Happy to take questions as well. The session that I wanted to talk about here today is really about Azure AD as a concept, what it is when it ties back to Office and Azure AD, and I'm going to share some information that is what we hear from customers and what I understand is top of mind. I want to say up front, I've been in the business for 15-20 years now. The last couple of years being a manager and a lead has taken me a little bit away from the technology, unfortunately. So I won't be diving super deep into demos and everything, but I'm more than happy to do follow-ups on topics later on with both myself and my team as well. So I'll give you an overview of security in Azure, give you an overview of the different components that we think about when top of mind Q&As that we hear from customers around Azure and identity, and then a little bit about what it would take to be developing applications using Azure AD. So not so much about what it means for Azure all up, but if it was actually about developing apps and what Azure AD could help and offer in that world. The way that Azure and we talk about the overall platform here at Microsoft, it's really one of the core platforms that we look at, and this is a important topic because many organizations and customers and partners and ISVs and would take you all over. When they think about identity in Azure AD specifically, they think about Office 365 because that's the first time any customer, any user gets interaction with identity is if they log into Office. But in fact, when we look at what we're really talking about is a platform underneath Azure, Power Platform, LinkedIn, Dynamics, GitHub. Well, GitHub not so much, but we integrate with GitHub still with Azure AD. But it's the platform that is being used by so many systems in our world. So Azure AD for us, the identity platform, is just like it was on-prem AD, 15 years ago when it started, roughly 15, not quite, but about 15 years ago with AD, where on the login for Windows, login with Windows desktops, you had more applications being built to integrate with Windows. We replicated that into the cloud, having a cloud platform for identity. But it's very clear and very important that it's not AD running in Azure. That's a different thing. AD running in Azure is really, if you run the normal Active Directory, it would be running it in virtual machines in Azure IaaS. But it's a global service. So just to give you an idea of a little bit of marketing-ish slides and so on, but give you an idea of what we're talking about is Azure AD as a platform today is roughly 30 billion authentications every day. So it's one huge big directory service that sits globally across the world with instances all over the world. It's not technically a set of domain controllers running in Azure, right? Roughly 250 million users every month logging in. And the left-hand side number is only the customers that have actually gone and acquired the paying licenses for Azure AD. You could get that with M365 or Azure AD Premium, as we call it. But as an Azure customer, you don't necessarily have any licenses for Azure AD Premium. So all up, there are over 1 billion different tenants in Azure AD for customers such as smaller organizations that don't use Office or just use Office and none of the premium features, so just use Azure. Why I'm talking about this is because we also have a core problem that we'll get into later on, which is understanding of when do I need a tenant? Why do I have a tenant? What's created to use a tenant? And one of our biggest, I would say, culprits or issues is actually Azure customers that are using Azure, developers using Azure that create, I need just another tenant for my application, or I need another tenant for this part of Azure and another tenant for this part of my company. So I'll talk a little bit about why that's a bad idea and what's the downsides of that. The also important as we talk about it, I'm just going to go a few things in here, but open standards is core for everything that we do, and you'll see the biggest difference between AD on-prem and Azure AD is Azure AD is a modern platform that talks basically as a service, versus AD on-prem, that is Kerberos and NTLM basically. That's it. LDAP, of course, as well. But for everything that we build, everything that we do in Azure AD, it's all open standards based, making sure that you can build applications, services, modern architectures using the technologies. Right? I got a couple of other slides just to level set on So we are all kind of, what is Azure AD? So bear with me a few minutes before we dig into the Azure side of it. But there are 4 different topics that we always talk about, which is, one is app access. How do I connect people, users, to applications? How do I protect their access? How do I engage with not just organizational users, but also if I have an application or a service, or I need to collaborate with partners or with guests, just like you invited me to this meeting today in Teams as a live event. We have plenty information, plenty guidance on how 2 organizations in Teams or 2 organizations within Azure. You can have an organization and a partner that collaborate together and get access to each other's resources. And then, of course, the last one being, how does identity play a role in adoption of and creation of applications overall? So I'll give you 1 slide per area, so to say, just to give you an idea of what when we talk about Azure AD, what it is all up for Microsoft and customers in general. And you just stop me if there are any chatting questions in the chat as well. So the first one being, this is a important slide because it talks about Azure AD and understanding what Azure AD does. And on the right-hand side here, it's about any application that's hosted in the cloud as a SaaS app, or an application that is, for example, custom built by your organization. It could be hosted in Oracle, Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, or whatever. We basically see them as your own custom applications, but the only key component there is that it's hosted outside of the corporate network, so to say. And if you want to host information or apps inside of the corporate network, on premises and web apps, we also have a way where there's a gateway in place, basically on premises, that allows the on-prem apps to be published and accessible through Azure AD, which is an interesting area, so that I can have all users, especially now in the world where we are with COVID and pandemic, blah, 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 everybody working from home. This part of the business has grown exponentially in the last few months about how do I make my on-prem apps available to all of the home workers and working from home, and enabling those scenarios. It's just not cloud. It's everything on-prem. And the core part of why an identity platform such as Azure AD is interesting is that it doesn't use the normal security patterns. So this is something that you will use for Azure services, Office, and all of the apps that I talked about earlier. It's the way that I can define an access policy that includes the user in his location, making sure that I have an application that I set up on premises, for example, and say you can only access this application if you are coming from, let's say you can even put it in, you can coming from Iceland, an IP address that's hosted in Iceland. I don't recommend doing IP addresses. It's so easy to spoof, but it's a location-based system, you can say. But combine that with, you have to be on a well-known managed device, or that your user risk is something that we look at dynamically every single time that you log into the system. Your user account is tagged with a risk level, low, medium, and high. And you can have a policy in place that basically says you can't access certain services unless your risk level is low. And if it's medium, we will trigger, for example, an MFA, or we'll trigger and say, you have to come in with a third-party MFA solution, or an MFA prompt, for example, or just block it. You can't get access to anything. Interesting topic is actually unlimited access. If I have applications such as SharePoint, I can say, if you are outside the network, or if you're on a non-managed device, let's say that you're on a vacation and you're on just a web browser, you can come in and just get access to read-only mode in SharePoint. But I can get access to my files. So I'm on the beach, or I'm somewhere playing golf or something, and the boss calls and say, hey, I got to get this number for this customer or this latest sales figure or something. You can always check in on that, even though you don't have, but you're on a device such as a phone or a lobby computer or something that will limit you down to just read access. And SharePoint, you can use that with other cloud brokers, what's called the CASB or Cloud Access Security Broker, and get access to other apps the similar way as well. So this is probably the biggest reason why Azure AD is used as a what we call control plane, or why is used as an access policy central, so that I can create access policies that are much greater than just you're on the network and you logged in. That was the old classic one, the network based. Now you can make all of these different configurations and set up that way. And then of course the protection, different ways to authenticate. I'm going to show this for a specific reason. We ask that you always enable MFA at a minimum on all administrative accounts to make sure that you don't allow logins. We've even set a standard. If you create a new tenant in Azure AD today, and this has been a few months now, that the MFA is added on the admin accounts or privileged accounts, making sure that you have that. And I say that because you can now do that with many different ways of authentication. It's not just a text message or an email and so on. You can choose your MFA methods across the board, and it really helps, and it prevents so many attacks. The third bucket in Azure AD is about the customers and partner scenarios, and where I take all my applications that I have and I extend it to users and that are in other platforms. Let's say that I am a company that sells this case it's a grocery store or a store of some sort, where I have a customer facing application or a partner facing application. I allow this to be easily configured so that I can allow my users to sign up either with an account that's stored in Azure AD, like a local account, or they bring their own account, a Google, a Facebook, a phone number. You can ask them to proof up with a credit card or a proving service. You can add a bunch of other data about the users. Just think about a scenario. You can think about, I don't know, ordering sandwiches online, like online ordering services. Movie theaters are using this service to just capture the users and login, and allow developers and the organization to sort of think about the core of the business, and almost, I'm going to say, outsource the authentication, login, and security to a cloud service, and just use a service that can do the authentication and management of users, password resets, and all that. The last part of it, before I dive directly into the specifics of Azure, is Azure AD and integration of applications. These are some of the features, capabilities, but Azure AD as a hub for apps, it could be used for applications just to provide sign-on. So it could be used just as a way, if you have a SAML app, you have a OIDC app, you can even use it for some of the Kerberos apps, and we'll come into that later on. And basically just providing single sign-on. But then you can also extend it to say, I want to be able to, my application that I built, a custom app or a cloud application, requires that there are user profiles or user data provisioned to the application. It could be an old application that uses a SQL database or a data store of some sort inside the application that needs data from the directory. Then you get into the world of provisioning, and it's using SCIM as a standard for provisioning data to the applications. It could be provisioning to Salesforce, to ServiceNow, to and from HR systems, but it can also be provisioning to on-premises applications and services. So that's another type of integration standpoint. And you can use one or the other, or just one. It depends on what your scenario is. And then if I'm developing apps that for companies that are using Office or Microsoft platforms, there's this cohesive, basically set of APIs that allow me to access data about the user, data about Office, so that I can extend the application to be more enriched and so on. It's super popular with things like Teams add-ons and Office add-ons, and the classic, one of the more classic applications that are being built is the phone lookup inside of a company. Anytime you want to look up people inside a company, or which emails they have, or if you have an app that needs to send email to other organizations or to other users and so on, you use Graph to do that. Any topics and questions so far, Gisli? You good?
Yeah, there's one question that here. Why should I use Azure AD instead of developing my own database, identity management?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I would go back and say, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So one of the core reasons is that I had a slide in the beginning that was like the marketing numbers of how many users and how many people and so on. One of the core benefits of using Azure AD is that it is already integrated with thousands of applications. There are templates or connectors already in place for thousands of applications. It's already done. It's already using Office login, Windows login. It's integrated already. If you build your own, I would say that the scenario for building your own is closest to where you're thinking about the what we call the B2C, the pictures I had about the grocery store or the online store scenario. That is definitely something we see customers have built their own. But I would go back and say, hey, did you build your own directory service on-prem in the on-prem world for the enterprise apps and for everything that's happening? Sure, you can run a on-premises, open source LDAP solution and so on, but it's just so much already done. There's so much security built in, there's so much governance built in, and so on. So it's a good, great question, but yeah.
Yeah, it's
definitely.
I mean, as you said earlier, that you can actually develop your own applications and utilize Azure AD as a primary authentication for customers. There are a lot of issues today. As you can see, Walmart losing their database to hackers and so on and so forth. Even so, built-in security features such as impossible travel, Azure AD can detect that. So you have all that security built in, so you don't need to create your own database, which is also a lot of effort for developers.
Yes, and I would say that one of the core, like if you look at differentiation of why Azure AD versus many other solutions in the market today that work with as a cloud database or as a directory service. One of the benefits of Microsoft in this world is that our identity services sit behind all of Microsoft services, like I talked in the beginning, all of Office. Also drive the division that I work in. We also own the MSA accounts, which is the Microsoft accounts, or Live or Hotmail or whatever, whenever you get into IT, what it was named, but the Microsoft accounts that run Xbox, Outlook Live, the personal accounts. And that by itself, and now all LinkedIn and GitHub, right? But that by itself means that we see a lot of traffic. And a lot of traffic, and this is interesting with an Azure crowd. If you think about Azure AI as an engine, right? I can't have AI-based analytics unless I have data. right?
Exactly.
AI is not magic. It's algorithms that we put in place to detect trends and detect and let the AI engines use the trends and use the data to get smarter over time. So our protection mechanisms in Azure AD when it comes to detecting risky logins, what you said, impossible travel, and those things is vastly greater than you would have a chance to do with just your own data, or a smaller vendor can do with just their data. Every single vendor in the market, every single solution in the market can make rules that are static, such as you can't log in from specific countries. You can't log in if you are non-managed device, or you can't log in, what you said, impossible travel. But it's the greater things where you can start to analyze trends within an organization. We look at, for example, if we see our system looks at traffic that comes in from a specific IP ranges in the world that hits Microsoft tenant, for example. The AI engine will pick those trends up and can apply that as trends across all other tenants, so that it can use that and say, already detected bad traffic going on and we're blocking it. Let's make sure that that's being blocked from all tenants, so we can benefit from that. And we also actually work from a law enforcement and all that as well. So it's a big engine that sits behind any sort of security, right?
Mm.
All right, so let's dive into some of the Azure resources and Azure AD resources that these are top of mind questions, and I'll be honest right away. Presentation wise, I put something together which is super broad, super wide, trying to capture as much as I could in a short amount of time. So you'll find something in here like, oh, come on, get through it. Know that you know already, but I want to level set and say, okay, here are the things that you need to think about that has to do with identity in Azure. And then in the end, also a few things about applications and developers and what that means and how for the services that are available. So first off is a popular topic, and it's one of the core things that it's in my work. I work in engineering. I work a lot with our sales teams and our business teams and licensing and so on. And I have a tag in my all out of office and all that. And I send emails like, you don't want engineering to answer licensing questions, right? You want to talk to your billing and sales and so on around licensing and money. But I want to break that right now, and I want to talk briefly about when it comes to Azure. One of the most asked questions, and this is when I talk to our teams inside of Microsoft, what are the questions the customer asks most about and get confused most about when it comes to Azure and Azure AD? It's really about tenants. Like, how many tenants did I create? Where did I create it? Who can create it? And why do I have so many? So I just want to give you a quick overview of if I have two different contract modes for organizations. You can have, and this applies also, the second one applies to if you just have a running contract, so to say. But as soon as I go into a billing mode, all of the tenant creation and Azure AD tenants are linked to some sort of contract with Microsoft or a sign up of Azure as a service. So if you create a new contract, it's at the enterprise level or organizational level. You can create, if you want, departmental separations in there, so you can send, they can pay for different things, or they can have resource assignments across different organizations. And then I do what's called the account owners, or the at the level where it says account owners. The account owners can actually create subscriptions. So this is where I could get into, I would call, jail or problems. If I have too many account owners start to create their own tenants. But also, if I don't understand how this is set up, I will have organizations, IT and developer organizations within my company starting to create their own tenants. because they don't know who the account owner is or who gets to create a tenant and how do I get access to the Contoso tenant or my organizational tenant. So I get all of these other tenants across the board, and they start to collect a lot of different tenants, and now you don't have single sign-on anymore. Now you don't have access to resources the same way as you thought. You could have one app running on one Azure AD tenant and another on another Azure AD tenant, and you don't have single sign-on anymore. You have different usernames, different passwords, and so on that you're running with. So I need to get a change on saying, okay, understanding who the account owners are, or if I am running the new model, which is customer agreements. It's just a newer version of the EA and the billing construct. I have something called subscription creators, which is much easier. It's an RBAC taxonomy. It's easier to understand what the roles are. And here I can actually delegate out and say, okay, I can delegate out to IT or developer architects or to the DevOps teams to go and facilitate subscription creation, so that if I need Azure environments, I will now be able to create a new subscription within the tenant architecture and have the same tenant, but I can have multiple subscriptions tied to that tenant. So I can have a developer environment for DevOps and so on. I can have that either as a pre-production or in production, and allow them to create tenants and allow them to delegate it out, so that you don't get creation of a bunch of new tenants all the time. So there's the links in the deck, and I'll share everything with you and so on. But definitely an area that needs to be understood by a lot of customers. I'll take the question, that one, later on. I know that one, it's coming up in a later slide. So let's dive into the first piece, which is RBAC. So for Azure and the RBAC world, there are two main parts of securing access to Azure resources using Azure AD, and why it's important to understand. There are two parts of it. One is the Azure RBAC, which is RBAC roles within Azure. The second one is a extension to that, which is called privileged identity management. And privileged identity management is something that is included in the paid licenses for Azure AD. Just to be clear, I want to be open and clear. Like that part is part of the paid licenses. But when I talk about roles, I have different security principles. I can have users, I can have groups, I can have service principals for applications and services, and I can also have managed identities, which is interesting when I get to the places of virtual machines, for example, or I build multi-tier applications, and I want to be able to use managed identities to give access to backend resources, for example, without having to have user accounts go all the way through the architecture, and not also use shared secrets, so to say, which is no, you cannot, you should not use a bunch of codes and shared secrets that way. But managed identities gives me a little bit more opportunities, and we're evolving managed identities over time as well, more and more. JIT, or just in time, is something which is very interesting for, especially when it comes to large organizations, or if you have a more evolved DevOps environment, is to have user accounts that don't have the role until they need it. So PIM is basically set in place so that I can have role activation policies. So you can have Brjann is allowed to do what we talked about earlier, subscription creation, for example, or a privileged role. But I have to go into the PIM system and say, I need this role, and I can add it like, because I'm going to do this. And then I get the role for set amount of time. And I can have a role connected back to the conditional access policies that said you can only use this role if you are on a specific network or specific level of your security and so on, and your CA policies, conditional access. So this will help you a lot with removing global admins. I don't need to be global admin all the time, right? You want to limit it down. And if you have global admins, make sure that they're PIM roles so that you get global admin for a limited amount of time and then you get out. You don't want to be global admin. You don't want to have persistent roles in this scenario of you being hacked, for example. If your accounts get compromised and it's a persistent role, it's game over, basically. But if your account gets hacked and it's being used as a time activated role, they only get the time if they only get to be admin during the time that you have that activated role specifically activated for you and it's active. That's a lot of active, by the way, in the word. So if I look at the access inheritance, this is kind of basics, but all the way through, I have different role basic, three different roles, the owner, contributor, and reader, so that I can go all the way down to resource groups and even to the specific resources inside of Azure and say, delegate it out to people that can just look at data, that can contribute and edit data, but also, and at the top being owners. So those are the kind of core constructs. And it's all access inheritance. If I'm the owner at the top, I'll be owner and the underlying structures, underlying components within RBAC. This is tied to things that you are familiar with, of course, the resource groups. I can have my roles being tied to a specific resource group. I can have RBAC tied to the subscription, to the resource group, or to the specific resource. Just be careful. It can be very, very detailed and very granular the further down you go. But one of the core, first examples and first scenarios we often talked about was to get somebody the right to, for example, let's say delete virtual machines within a resource group. You don't want to have that as a right for everybody, but you need to be able to manage and view and read them. Or you can even go as down far as say how do you back up and restore data, or who can read security logs is another way to look at RBAC at a specific resource level. Another world that I often talk about is the on the right hand side of this one, the VNet or the red boxes in here. In the on-premises world, for many years, we would never allow an IT pro or a developer or somebody to go and mess with the Cisco routers. Like the routers and the networking was hands off. It was only the security teams or the network operations team that could handle the network, because we knew if somebody did it, you'd be messed out. If somebody messed up networking, you could lose the whole network, right? Somebody did it wrong and we know the bigger outages on the cloud are usually, load balancing problems or DNS problems and so on. But in Azure, oftentimes if a developer or an IT pro or somebody creates their own Azure subscription and Azure application, they go in and they create their own little world and say, oh, here's my application, here's my project running, and I'm the network admin. Oh, I need to connect the network in my Azure to the network on-prem. So I create a connection between the two because I'm the admin, so I can do that. But what I just did as an is to create a potential huge, big backdoor into the organization, right? If you allow users to create instances in Azure, you're also allowing users to create backdoors to on-prem, because you have VPNs and you have other things that you can connect the two networks together. So please think about the network security and the resource security here as well. I had a question, can you lock yourselves out of RBAC? Yes, you can lock yourself out of RBAC, and you can lock yourselves out of admin accounts, which is why there are specific guidances around what's called break class accounts. So you think through, always have one or two accounts that are permanent, that have permanent roles, and have them locked away, basically user accounts that you don't use for anything. And if you look up, I can share it, or we can share it later on in the user group, the guidance on break class accounts overall in administration. Already talked about it. Just another way to look at the resource groups and kind of inheritance levels. You can have it at every level. You can have reader, contributor, owner at every single level, and it goes all the way down to the resource itself. And also tied to this is management groups. It's just another layer on top of it, but you can tie RBAC together with management groups as well, the same way as you do here with basically resource groups. There are a bunch of built-in roles, but if you look at the possibilities of custom roles is also there. So if you have specific scenarios, and it's very popular in the DevOps world, where I say I need to have a bot or an automated system that gets to create or instantiate large new deployments, for example. You could be very prescriptive in saying this is specifically what a role can do. Or if you have a partner that you outsource your security operations to, for example, you can go in and say they have the specific right to go in and do read logs or view audits and so on, very at a very granular level. So the custom roles is popular, but also again, you can tie them back into PIM, but be careful not to have too many and too complex, so because then you can lose the overall view of it and kind of well, lock yourself out of RBAC or just get problems that with too much details. And custom roles is definitely something that most organizations will get to a place where they need to use 1 or 2 or maybe 10 or 15, but up to 5,000 is supported. But RBAC examples, it's pretty basic stuff. And then it's if I go through each one of the levels, what we usually do is to not do it, maybe do it based on users, but using Azure AD groups. So managing Azure AD groups mapped to Azure AD roles is a great way to do it. And here comes a scenario that a lot of companies, organizations can do is if you already today have a good understanding and a good process for managing groups and identities on premises. Like you have AD, you have a lifecycle management system that you know exactly who's a member of every group and who manages the groups and all that on-prem. Because you extend AD to Azure AD with, you provision the users and groups to Azure AD, you can have the master being on-prem, or you can use the groups inside of your roles. So you can continue to leverage your lifecycle and your governance on-prem, but just provision the users into cloud and don't change them in the cloud. And they actually, if you try to change them in the cloud, they get overwritten and so on. But so you can connect this either to Azure AD native groups or groups that are provisioned from on-prem AD as well, mapping it back to your own world, so to say. PIM, a quick kind of setup of PIM. So on the left-hand side, I have the PIM service. So in PIM, I create a bunch of roles. I had the roles that I have. I add a group, a security group, and say, here are all my, let's say I have all my developers, and all developers in the company, they have the ability to go and request a specific role. I can request a role of creating virtual machines, for example. Right? I don't have that right all the time, but I can go in and I can request a role. They go to PIM. You can have a workflow engine behind it and says somebody has to approve it, or you can just auto approve it if it's a low privilege role. And then it goes through, checks for the role information, updates the target systems with the role assignment. So you get added to a group, and then it gets added into the resource manager. And then, of course, the best part about this is tracking. Who did what? Who changed the VMs? Who changed the networking? Who logged into the VMs and did this and that? I now know who got the role, who owned the role of global admin when the company network went down, right? And then you can either, use that to, fire the person, or use that log to actually go in and understand what happened and do the backtracking needed, right? I'm not saying it's a good idea, but there are worlds where you have shared accounts, for example, or group accounts. This is a great way to have a role instead of having a shared global admin account, right? You don't want to have a shared global admin account because then you don't know who logged into it. But having global admins as a role that is PIM, you can allow 10 or 15 people to get the role, but you knew who it was and what they did. You can also give that use it as a separation of duties, so that no single one global admin can give himself or herself the admin rights without another person approving it. That way you have separation of duties, or at least you have a way to limit the risks of somebody being mad and angry in the morning and early in the morning at 4 a.m. doing something.
I have a question about this.
Yep.
You have to assign the PIM license to the user to be able to collect the data, right?
Yes. Yeah. PIM is licensed. PIM you have to assign users. Absolutely, you're correct. The PIM is one of the only real features in Azure AD that is a paid feature that makes sense for companies to actually buy just licenses for the users that need it. Does it make sense? So you could have 100 people in the organization, but you only buy 10 the P2 because this is a premium license, premium P2 plan. You could buy just P2 for those people, just because you need PIM and you need the privileged identity management.
And it would be included in E5?
Yes, E5. E5 includes P5. E5 includes P2, yes. And E3 includes P1, yes. You can buy it standalone, or you can buy it as part of the SKUs, so to say. And as an Azure customer, we do see customers quite a bit buying. You might be using Google, right? Actually, Google Apps and Google Google Online Apps is one of the top used SaaS apps within Azure AD. Kind of interesting. So companies using Azure AD to log into Google Apps for their collaboration and so on. But then they would buy Azure AD Premium for that and not the Office Suite licenses. Of course, I'm not going to go through every single one of the identity security best practices. This is a way too many boxes for a simple, like, here's a checklist of things to do. There's a link at the bottom, but these are things that are specifically tied to Azure environments, so that one of the core things in the first two boxes at the top, I'll talk about 2 or 3 of these. Treat identity as the primary security perimeter. That's all about the first 2 slides I showed in the beginning about conditional access. Not just relying on the network as a security perimeter, but allowing on being able to set a policy that says you can log into your developer machine or your Azure environment only if you are on the network and on a device that you're trusted. So very popular that you have to log into a specific virtual machine in order for you to go and administer maybe even a GitHub repository, right? You can access to GitHub can only be done from a specific machine or a specific network. Gives you greater possibilities for that. Centralization of identity management is all about that world of, okay, how many tenants do I want, and where do I want to put the policies? If I've invested in the policies and in PIM and in tenant management and single sign-on for end users, if I have multiple identity tenants, then you don't have that anymore. You don't have a single sign-on. You don't have the abilities to do audits and tracking across the whole organization. So trying to centralize it, and that's connected to manage connected tenants as well. Trying to centralize it is super important for us. And then you have things in here such as use Azure AD for storage authentication inside of Azure. Depending on which Azure service you have, there are different ways to use managed identities. Use Azure AD for storing the users and credentials, and using Azure AD groups, again tied to PIM or tied to the on-prem world and so on, that you can leverage, right? So really going through this is a great way to kind of highlight what the best practices are and where there might be gaps in your own environment. So I have a couple of more things to talk about, and that kind of around apps and developers. And I'm not gonna talk about like, here's the code you have to write. I will share the deck out so you can use it as well. But the first one is about a feature within Azure AD called domain services. It's a specific way, a specific topic that we'll talk about, and then a little bit about developers in Azure AD, the experiences, and then securing access, and then why kind of Azure AD is important, and why it's important for applications to be integrated with Azure AD. So I know it's a little bit time crunch, but Azure AD Domain Services is a managed domain controller in Azure. So now we are talking virtual machines. We are talking the ability for me to think about, I have an application on-prem that's been using Kerberos and LDAP or NTLM for all these years. And now I want to start to move that app maybe into Azure IS. But I don't want to host my on-premises AD in the cloud. I have Azure AD, I have the connection, I'm syncing users to Office, to Azure, and to the cloud. And if I go in and I turn on Azure AD Domain Services, and that's a checkbox in the system, you turn on Azure AD Domain Services, Azure AD and Azure will provision domain controllers managed by Microsoft, domain controllers in that Azure subscription connected to that VNet. And then the users in Azure AD will be synchronized provision to that AD. This is now an instance where you are connecting an ability to have apps that still think they should use a classic AD, Kerberos, NTLM, but run in VMs in Azure, or if you wanted to do cross-network architectures, like you could have some, this is latency problems to do this, but you can have the backend on-prem or the backend in the cloud, the front end in prem, or separate it out, but still have a way where I can actually have the AD on-prem talk to a AD in the cloud, not Azure AD in the cloud, but AD in the cloud. You can have a user forest or resource forest set up, but it really allows me to make it look and feel like I have a normal on-premises Active Directory, but it runs in Azure AD, or runs in Azure, runs in Azure. Biggest difference there is that the user provisioning side of the house happens in this one in the middle, right? So user provisioning happens with Azure AD Connect. The on-prem AD to Azure AD sync is already set up. It synchronizes users, passwords, SIDs. It doesn't take everything in AD on-prem. If you have a, you do your normal thing that I've seen happen, unfortunately, is a company that kind of shares and says, well, we have AD on-prem. Why don't we put one of the domain controllers in the cloud? Well, then I have all my users in that cloud. Here I have a possibility to separate it out and say, I only want the users that I synchronize with Azure AD Connect. So I can leave the on-premises privileged accounts on-prem completely. You can have your backup operators and other things. You can just leave it on-prem. You don't have any connection at all to the cloud with that. So you can do a little bit of separation there as well. And then how it works, like this is just an example. You can use it as a together with jump boxes. You can use it together with different virtual or in virtual network, where I put specific apps talk to specific network in Azure, and they will just see this. The apps will just see this as a domain controller. You don't have to do anything special on the apps, because the apps are just going to see it as a normal AD domain controller in the cloud. So it's kind of a way to extend that and then support the, I would say lift and shift scenarios. This is the most common one. Specifically around what developers ask when they think about, okay, this is related to the first question we got, which was, why don't I create my own directory? And they are similar questions around if I use if I build applications and I deploy applications into a cloud and use a cloud identity provider, can I leverage my existing identity management solutions? How easy it is to build authentication? Like all of us have built or done applications that are Kerberos integrated. It's easy to do. We know how it's done. There are templates. There are plenty of examples for it. How does that work when I move to the cloud? And of course, security capabilities, right? The developer platform, the reason why we want to do it and kind of the platform in there is really to allow us to have simple tooling. We build the SDKs, we build the client libraries, we build the plugins into the IDEs or the development environments, Visual Studio, but also others to support creation of applications that can just easily log into the service, that can access different organizational data if I need to, an app that wants to read user information, office information, app information, and so on. Allow it to comply with IT, and this goes back to conditional access or single sign-on, or how do I operate my environment, to using a single directory for all of that. Allows us to be complying with IT and our access policy, so to say. The things that we can build, I'm just going to build it all out, is basically we have ways where we can register applications either through APIs or just in the Azure portals. And register application means that the app is known to Azure AD. Every app that wants to use Azure AD as a source has to be registered. You can do it through APIs, we can do it through the portal, and they're easy, kind of quick starts to get started. You have libraries that automate a bunch of things for you. So if you start an application, it will automate some of the flows that are needed and some of the PKCE things that need to happen with private keys and so on. A lot of things are just automated for you, and when you use the libraries this way. APIs, of course, APIs for Graph, APIs for Azure, APIs that you own yourself, APIs for Azure AD as part of Graph as well in there. When I build applications, I can build apps for one or multiple different identity sources. I can build it for Azure AD, or I can build it for all of them at the same time, so that the libraries and the SDKs and so on all work with independent of which type of app I'm using. So if I'm building an app that is for customers, I don't have to choose like, oh, I only have to use Google, or I only have to use Facebook, or I only have to use Microsoft accounts. It can use any one combination of those, any combination that you want of apps, corporate organizations, school account, work accounts, personal, or of course, customer and partners. And then sign-ins. Luckily enough, there's you choose your own language that you want to use with. I can't say that everything is there, but we're working hard to meet developers where they are to ensure that you can do .NET, JS, and so on in there. And it's definitely something that I know my team is doing. What's called on Twitch, there's a show called 425 Show that does two days a week. They do a live coding and live Q&A with different people that just go through like, how is this done, and just have a chat around it and talk about different scenarios that use different coding languages, different IDEs, and different scenarios that developers meet all the time, especially targeted towards developers and scenarios that maybe are not so familiar with the Microsoft platform overall. And then, of course, the richer experiences is one of the core things that they kind of allow is to, if you wanted to create apps, and this could be in Azure, this could be somewhere else, allows me to access both M365 services, but also Azure AD people, users, groups, managed groups, managed users, and so on inside of my applications. I can do that through Graph, so to say. I don't know everything else. I'm going to speed up a little bit so we can get through this. Already talked about it. So I'm just summarize it up and say, like, look at the integration of tools, whether that the tools themselves are using, you're building something for M365 or you're using Azure services, identity. Our identity platform allows, go back to the first one we talked about, either single sign-on, the provisioning parts, or being enriching, like how do I access more parts of my service through M365, or how do I use more of the services within the Azure services. Allows me to do that. Common for all of that is just how we use identity as part of that. We are aware no developer wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to develop an identity app. Like, no, identity is the thing that developers want to get rid of. Like, how do I get rid of having to worry about logging in, user authentication, and all that? We're trying to make that as easy as possible. Drop in the right libraries, go and click on a few things, enter the right codes, and then you're done. You should be as easy at that. And the quick starts that we're creating should go and drive that for us. So summarizing, I'm just going to put the slide in the beginning and then do a Q&A.
Yeah.
That's the one I want to end on. Okay, a couple of questions. Can you log yourself out of RBAC? I talked about that one. Yes, you can. So be careful. Most of that is about break class accounts. Do you need to pay extra for utilizing Azure AD for web apps that I'm developing? No, you don't need to pay extra for Azure AD at all. Azure AD includes what's called a free tier. So free tier allows you access to the Azure AD platform, all the development stuff that I talked about, but you don't get the capabilities of PIM, for example. You don't get the capabilities of the conditional access. So developing the applications and making the apps work, similar to what you did in on-premises AD, is just included. You have to have an Azure AD, so you have to have an Azure tenant or Azure subscription of some sort. But even that one could be a free one or could be a low tier one, right? But there's no need to actually go and buy Azure AD unless you need any one of the kind of more premium features that are part of it. So that's a really good question. The one that's interesting as well is if you wanted to build the web apps for consumers, what we call Azure AD B2C or external identities. One is not just about the internal organization, but it's about extending and building apps that you're going to use for your customers. Azure AD B2C is actually licensed in a different way so that you can license it based on just usage. The more users you have, the more you pay. The more users monthly you have, the more you pay. So there is a model for that, which is very, very interesting for a lot of organizations. And you have to come up with a lot of users before the bill gets high. It's very, very licensing wise. I'm gonna say cheap because everything costs money, but it's very well priced and well targeted at testing things out. Anything else, Gisli?
Yeah, there's no more questions here. So
do you have questions?
Yeah, well, one of the question that Gunnar here asked is that pay extra for utilizing Azure AD.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that we are creating an application that contains anonymous users or users that are not registered with the domain name.
Mm-hmm.
How does that work? So basically, users are registering with their own domain name.
Mm-hmm.
How does the Azure AD have the database around that?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So there's two things in there. I would say, unfortunately, two scenarios in there. One is I am an organization. You are creating an application that say that you want to share your application or even Office with your partners, right? You you can build an app that allows users outside of your org. So your org is Brekkan.com, but your users companies or your partners is Coca-Cola or Iceland or whatever you want to call it. They need to access applications within that you have in your organization. We have something in Azure AD called business to business scenarios, which allows me to have external users invited to access resources in Azure AD. So external identities is a feature for us that where you can license it so that you can license it per month. And say every active user that comes in, you pay a small fee, or you have a feature in Azure AD that allows for every licensed user I have 5. Basically, I can invite 5 people. But most organizations today use this new licensing model of monthly active users and pay 0. I don't know exactly the price, but a low cost per monthly user that logged in. The database in Azure AD supports it. So you could have a Teams channel, for example, that allows for collaboration across tenants. Also, if you are using an organization that has multiple Azure ADs, then you don't pay. Like Azure AD B2B, the technology to allow users from one tenant to be invited and use resources from the other, allows you to do that because you already have 2 Azure ADs. The underlying technology is there in place to allow guests to access resources. But if you want to allow it en masse to hundreds and thousands of users and so on, there are ways to do that as well, where it's not within your own organization. So that's it. But if you have all the apps that I talked about, if you're looking at building an app for, they are for external users, then the external identity model, which is just license per MAU, monthly active user that logs in, is spot on. It's super easy to do. We can have a long new conversation about that one because it's actually an area that when we talk about it with organizations and especially on the Twitch show, a lot of times like we had no idea Microsoft did this. We had no idea that this was available. So it'd be cool to do that for you. Yeah.
There's no other question here coming up, so we are also out of time. So I think this is the end of it.
Perfect.
So this is very informing, I would say, especially the PIM, utilizing the PIM.
Yeah.
And I would just say thank you for presenting this to us and giving your time to us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Please don't feel, please add on to the Azure or the Iceland user group on Facebook. Conversations there, ask questions, come up with new topics that I can help with. I'm happy to get some people on, other people in my team or in the engineering team to come and talk to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tack för mig.
Yeah. Tack för det. Bye bye.